Hello, and welcome back to the Ramsay online lecture series for 2020, this extraordinary and disturbing year. I'm Simon Haynes. This is the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization, and my guest today is Peter Baldwin, a Labour politician of great distinction and courage, who served as the Federal Minister for Education in both the Hawke and Keating governments in the 1990s, and also held the federal seat of Sydney for 15 years in the 80s and 90s, having earlier been a member of the New South Wales Legislative Council for 7 years. After leaving politics, Peter developed an unusual and influential web-based tool for mapping complex public policy debates around the world. It's called Debate Graph, and it's been used in the past by the White House, by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the UK, and by CNN series Amanpour. Peter also chairs the Blackheath Philosophy Forum. And typically forthright, he's entitled his two-part talk, Turning Back the Woke Tide. So here is Peter Baldwin.
I'd like to thank the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization and especially its director, Simon Haynes, for providing this opportunity to reflect further on what I said in my article published in the Weekend Australian on 11th of July. I greatly admire the work of your centre as it pursues its vital educational initiatives and your tenacity in the face of sustained opposition. When I was Minister for Higher Education years ago, I would have found it hard to envisage a day when academics who gripe constantly about real and imagined cuts would demand their institutions knock back generous offers of funding. Strange times. In the article, I argued that we in the West inhabit a civilization that is starting to loathe itself, one in which the entire educational system at all levels, increasingly reinforced by media, political and corporate elites, is largely enthralled to an ideology intent on portraying Western civilization as an unbroken litany of oppression, racism, slavery, colonialism, pretty much without redeeming features, the source of just about all the world's ills. We see the bizarre spectacle of crowds of white people, middle-class, educated white people, mainly young, engaging in ritual prayer-like denunciations of whiteness and white people. We hear academics and compeers on ABC likening being white to original sin, for which only partial redemption is available by acknowledging privilege and becoming a loyal ally of the oppressed. I claim that what we are experiencing has distinct echoes of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the forced apologies for ideological heresies, the destruction and deprecation of statues and other symbols of an irredeemably tainted past, the rigid enforcement of speech codes that police the boundaries of what can be said and thought when it rubs up against the latest iteration of the ever-changing identity politics ideology. Identity politics is the ideological core of the worldview that rationalises and underpins these developments. It is invariably accompanied by the system of thought control that we nowadays label political correctness, which functions as the compliance and enforcement arm of the identity politics ideology. Political correctness mandates that any dissent from identitarian orthodoxies not be debated seriously, but requires denunciation not just of the heretical idea, but the speaker, who is ipso facto a bad person, a bigot, a racist, a fascist, even a Nazi. It also demands punishment in forms ranging in severity from social media mobbing and social obloquy to career destruction for alleged malefactors, with little or no opportunity to mount a defence. In some cases, dissenting speech is deemed by the ideologues to constitute violence against oppressed people, warranting actual kinetic counter-violence in response. So we see masked, black-shirted thugs who style themselves as anti-fascists or Antifa, violently attacking gatherings of their opponents. No sense of historical irony, these people. The situation we now find ourselves in is the culmination of an extraordinarily successful project captured succinctly in a phrase that appeared in correspondence in the mid-1960s between Herbert Marcuse, a major figure in the later development of critical theory, first hatched by the Frankfurt School of Marxist theorists in the aftermath of World War I, and the German radical activist Rudi Dutschke. The phrase was the long march through the institutions of power. As the Vietnam War radicalisation of young boomers and the fantasies of imminent revolution faded, attention turned to the long view and a strategy to capture the institutions of society, starting with higher education. It was an explicitly totalitarian project. In a notorious essay titled Repressive Tolerance, published in 1965, Marcuse gives a broad outline of what he had in mind, conceding that at the time it seemed hopelessly utopian. He envisaged a future in which tolerance of speech would be governed by a distinction between what he called repressive tolerance, by which he meant tolerance of right-wing speech that reinforces and perpetuates the current oppressive power structures, and liberating tolerance that promotes challenges to the existing order. Repressive tolerance was to be, well, repressed. Liberating tolerance was to be fostered. Marcuse stressed the crucial role of academia in bringing about these developments, but contended that this required a major re-engineering of what is taught in the universities. With academia as a foothold, the influence of this thinking would spread out, with each successive generation of graduates to the wider society. I doubt that even Marcuse could have envisaged the extent of the success of this project, which seemed to flow organically from the initial Vietnam War radicalisation of the baby boomer generation. I wonder if Marcuse would have been struck by the irony that his project has even extended to the most powerful corporations in the world, the social media giants, that he would presumably have seen as his strongest adversaries. Little did he know that as things would develop, woke leftist ideology would provide these corporations with a way to signal their virtue, to exhibit their commitment to social justice without endangering their wealth and power. How perfect. How important is this in the long-term scheme of things? Some are inclined to minimise the problem by saying we're going through a period of essentially well-motivated, exuberant excess, maybe even a bout of temporary insanity, and that things will calm down in due course, just like they did in the early 1970s after the upheavals of the late 1960s. This is far too complacent for two reasons. Firstly, there is little precedent for the degree of political polarisation and the widespread recourse to violence that we see today. This is particularly so in the United States since the George Floyd killing, where parts of cities have been torched, and in some, like Portland, rioting has been going on for a considerable time, aided and abetted by a media that insists on describing these events as essentially peaceful. This is compounded by the withdrawal, or at least the stepping back, of police efforts to maintain law and order, to the point that police simply fail to intervene as businesses are looted and private homes invaded. The role and very existence of police is increasingly questioned, despite clear evidence that their absence leads to dystopian hellholes of perpetual violence, looting and destruction. Recently, there's been a further disturbing development in America. Gangs of rioters, originally largely confined to inner urban areas, invading suburbs and in some cases being confronted by armed citizenry, as happened when a mob went to the home of Seattle Police Chief Carmen Best. Best, a black woman, has been a rare voice of courage and sanity, who opposed from the outset the surrendering of part of inner Seattle to the mob. Having received next to no support from the city council and other local political leaders, she has just thrown in the towel and resigned her position. In a recent analysis, the Australian counterinsurgency expert David Kilcullen has suggested that the situation developing in the US can be characterised as a state of incipient insurgency that could spiral into widespread violence. That the leading nation of the free world should have breached this point should concern us all. The second point is that this is happening at a time when the global liberal order and the free societies they embody face very serious challenges from regimes and ideologies that posit very different societal models. Recall Francis Fukuyama's famous claim in the 1990s that the fall of the Soviet bloc marked the end of history, by which he meant that human social evolution had basically ended with the triumph of liberal democracy and market economics. Of greatest salience, especially to Australia, is the emergence of the Chinese Communist Party regime as a contender for global industrial, technological, and military dominance. This regime is well along developing systems of totalitarian surveillance and control beyond even the nightmares of George Orwell. It is leveraging technologies like AI to solve the most significant obstacle in the way of Orwell's projected 1984 dystopia. Even with Orwell's telescreens in every house, someone has to do the monitoring. AI offers a solution to the monitoring problem, with software agents tirelessly looking for patterns and associations suggestive of incipient dissent, right down to facial expressions. A recent leak of Chinese data indicates this surveillance is now being extended into the home. This would be bad enough if confined within China's borders, but as we are learning every day, the regime is intent on exerting regional and ultimately global dominance. We see Australia's universities becoming increasingly dependent on the fee income from Chinese students, the crack cocaine of Australian higher education funding. This income, in some cases amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars, can be turned off overnight by the CCP regime, a threat they have not hesitated to use recently as Australia disputes regime claims about the virus and the CCP's territorial ambitions. And don't the universities know it? They've become terrified of tolerating, let alone doing, anything that might offend their masters. What are we to make of the University of Queensland mobilising all of its considerable legal resources against the philosophy student Drew Pavlou, who organised a demonstration in support of the people of Hong Kong, which was viciously attacked by a gang of several hundred pro-Beijing students, in scare quotes. Worse, some vice-chancellors have gone even further, in effect becoming apologists and enablers of the regime, with one prominent figure going way beyond his expertise, talking about the need for governments and politicians to avoid, quote, xenophobic blatherings, and dismissing intelligence agency concerns about CCP activities in Australia. Given this, what are the prospects for honest, objective scholarship about contemporary China, its political system, the nature of its relations with other countries, including Australia? As a number of commentators have stressed, the main effect is likely to be what is not investigated, the contentious issues that are not explored and debated, the research that is not conducted in order to avoid offending Chinese sensibilities. In a talk titled Engineers of the Soul, Ideology in Xi Jinping's China, delivered to the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the former China correspondent and principal international advisor to the department, John Garner, described how the CCP regime under Xi is pushing an ideological revival that he describes this way, quote, Mr. Xi did not invent this ideological project, but he has hugely reinvigorated it. For the first time since Mao, we have a leader who talks and acts like he really means it. And he is pushing communist ideology at a time when the idea of communism is as unattractive as it has been at any time in the past 100 years. All that remains is an ideology of power, dressed up as patriotism. But that doesn't mean it cannot work. And then he adds this crucial point, quote, the challenge for us is that Xi's product of total ideological control does not stop at China's borders. It is packaged to travel with Chinese students, tourists, migrants, and especially money. It flows through the channels of the Chinese language internet, pushes into all the world's major media and cultural spaces, and generally keeps pace with and even anticipates China's increasingly global interests, end quote. Pretty disturbing stuff. I recently hosted an online discussion with Clive Hamilton, the Australian academic who founded the left-leaning think tank, the Australia Institute, who has written 2 books that lay out in exhaustive detail the scope of CCP influence operations around the world. Given all this, you may be wondering, where are all the champions of academic freedom and institutional autonomy? that so vociferously opposed every attempt to establish any course sponsored by the Ramsay Centre? Surely every staff association, every student group, especially those that imagine themselves progressive, would be shouting from the rooftops about all this, throwing their full weight behind persecuted students, and staffers forced to apologise for any territorial map or observation that offends CCP sensitivities. They must be seething with rage, surely. And as for those Confucius institutes, that senior regime figures have frankly stated a part of the CCP's global propaganda apparatus, well, they must be breathing fire about them. Well, maybe I missed it, but I've yet to see a single expression of concern from any of these fearless fighters for social justice about these matters. According to Drew Pavlou, he has received precisely zero support from Queensland University staff associations and youth student groups. This, in spite of him being, except for this issue, a hardline leftist himself. Not much solidarity there. Actually, it is worse than that. The UQ chapter of Socialist Alternative actually conflated protests against the CCP regime and the local Confucius Institute with racism. And how about the Sydney University Student Representative Council Education Officer, Lily Campbell, another socialist alternative activist, who berated Michael Spence for even negotiating with the Ramsay Centre during an episode of Q&A. When asked for comment by Australian Financial Review journalist Robert Baldwin, she declined to comment on the Confucius Institute. How to account for this? Actually, it all makes a certain sense. If Western civilization, this wretched product of those wretched white people, is so abominable, then why should we be concerned about a foreign totalitarian regime intruding into all aspects of our societies, including and especially the education system? After all, CCP totalitarianism could not be any worse than what we have already, could it? So why worry? Taking up these matters would just distract us from the important work of opposing those sinister Ramsay courses that might confuse our narratives. This might actually seem logical to young and not so young people who are devoid of any worthwhile historical knowledge, but thoroughly indoctrinated in the verities of identity politics. The French writer Pascal Bruckner wrote presciently about the self-loathing mindset of progressive academia a decade ago in his book, The Tyranny of Guilt, an essay on Western masochism. Here is his summation, quote, "First of all, the duty to repent forbids the Western Bloc, which is eternally guilty, to judge or combat other systems, other states, other religions. Our past crimes command us to keep our mouths closed. Our only right is to remain silent." And here is his devastating conclusion. Indulgence towards foreign dictatorships, intransigence towards our democracies, an eternal movement, critical thought, at first subversive, turns against itself and becomes a new conformism, but one that is sanctified by the memory of its former rebellion, end quote. So what can be done? I take this up in part 2 of this talk.
Peter, thank you. Well, we're certainly in the thick of the debate already, and that's only the first part of your talk. So perhaps I might just ask you one question at this point, and it concerns the role of the police, and in particular your reference to the Seattle police chief, Carmen Best, who sounds to me like a woman of real principle placed in an impossible situation. I noticed that in her resignation speech, which is widely quoted, available online, she says, "We're in the middle of a social reckoning, racial reckoning in the country, and we have to acknowledge that policing has a history that has in many ways been conducive to the racism that we're experiencing. But we also have to acknowledge, this is still Carmen Best, that policing is working really hard to change that narrative, and we need to work with the public to figure out how we're going to do that." So, Peter, would you agree that there hasn't been enough said, or at least reported in this country, about the fact that there are many reasonable people, including especially Black police officers, who both accept the need for reform and reject the anarchic violence, much of it driven by white people. You speak eloquently about the violence, but surely there's an urgent need for reform of some sort too, as she says. Of course, that doesn't mean defunding, but surely it means going well beyond charging Derek Chauvin and his fellow officers with murder to some sort of systematic investigation by numerous state jurisdictions into their police forces. Would you be able to comment on all of that?
Yes, thanks for that question, Simon. I think that raises an important point. Carmen Best, who was the police chief in Seattle, who's a black woman, is clearly very alienated and very concerned about the way things were developing in the aftermath of these various incidents. And a person of obvious considerable principle who's prepared to put her own career on the line in order to underscore the point that she was trying to make. But I just make a number of preliminary points before I talk a bit about, the need for reform and the best circumstances. The first thing to note, I think, is that contrary to much media coverage, there is clearly not an epidemic of lethal police violence against black people. The Washington Post compiled a set of statistics for the year 2019, which indicate, I think, a bit over 1,000 total shootings, lethal shootings of police of black people. People overall, a bit over 1,000 shootings of all people, of which 235 were of black people. And of those, 9 were of unarmed black people. And in addition to that, there were 19 shootings of unarmed white people. And this is in a context where there is something of the order of 10 million interactions between police and the public in any given year. So it's a very small number. And while you could say, blacks accounted for about a quarter of the shootings, which is well above their proportion to the population, which is 13 or 14%. The point that needs to be borne in mind is that, while that's true, it's also the case that blacks were involved in 53% of the homicides, and 61%, I think it is, of violent robberies. So to the extent that the real relevant consideration here is not population shares, but numbers of interactions with the police force, which can give rise to these situations. Now, as to whether there's a systemic tendency for police to shoot black people, unarmed black people especially, more than other people, there have been a number of studies that indicate that just is not the case. There was one published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, which by a number of researchers who concluded, I'm quoting, "We did not find evidence for anti-black or anti-Hispanic disparity in police use of force across all shootings, and if anything, found anti-white disparities when controlling for race-specific crime." Now, I should say, I quoted this in the Australian article, and there was an immense Twitter storm started up to try and force the authors of this study to retract it. And they did put a statement out saying, that they thought their conclusions had been misused, but they basically stood by their methodology with a fairly minor adjustment that doesn't change the thrust of the thing. But in addition to that, and in a sense more significantly, there's a very thorough piece of research by Professor Roland Fryer at Harvard University, economics professor at Harvard University, who's a black person, a black professor of economics, and he reached essentially the same conclusion, that when it comes to lethal force by police, whichever way you analyse the data, you can't avoid the conclusion that there really is no evidence of a race-based disparity. Now, I should add to that, he was also careful to stress that there did seem to be evidence of greater use of force by police against black people, a non-lethal force, in other words, things like pushing people against a wall and, I guess using batons and so forth. And the significant part of that, I thought, was that that disparity, a 20% disparity, applied even where the person that the police were dealing with was in fact compliant with the police. So yes, there is an issue there. But he also, Roland Fryer, the same professor, also made the point, and I think it's that investigations by police following incidents can have counterproductive effects if they're carried out in the immediate aftermath of a viral incident like the George Floyd one, which creates a climate where police really back off from the kind of active policing which you need to sort of preempt crime, and which has been so significant in bringing homicide rates down. So what that seems to point to is that, okay, yes, there's room for reform, but it's best done in a context of calm consideration. You want to avoid the situation we now have, where you have a cowed and intimidated police force that, as a result of which you get a dramatic fall in active policing, which Fryer and his research documented, especially in the case of, in a number of celebrated incidents. And in fact, one estimate is that after the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, back in 2014, there was something of the order of 2,000 excess deaths. And we're seeing a similar surge in homicides after the George Floyd incident and the upsurge that followed. It was a terrible incident, and people's response is understandable. But the pattern of activism that we see, which completely deprecates the police and maligns all of them for the actions of a small number, really is counterproductive if you're sincerely interested in protecting black lives. But the bottom line here, as in a number of other areas, is that the wokest ideologues, if you like, really don't seem to care that much about that. Deaths only matter if they conform to their narrative. And their activism is frankly terribly counterproductive. And I think it's important that conservative politicians, everybody, but including conservative politicians, should stop lending credence to the narrative.
Peter, thank you. And to our viewers, please tune in to the second part of this talk shortly.